Hello, Angela. Do you hear me?
I can't hear. Oh,
Yeah, we can hear you.
oh, we can hear you. Oh, good. Now I can hear you.
Oh, perfect. How are you?
I'm doing all right. How's everything with you?
Everything's going really great. Thank you so much for joining us. Are you in your dining room?
I am, but you can't really tell, can you?
Well, cheers. Cheers to you.
All right,
Thank you so much for joining. This is a series that we have now. You know, given the conditions we're under, we're calling it Busboys and Friends, and you are definitely a friend. So thank you so much for being part of this.
Yes, many years ago, when I was in jail in New York, I went on a hunger strike because I was being held in solitary confinement. When they released me, I ate the first meal that the jail, this was the jail in New York, had prepared, which was, I think, a pork chop. I didn't know anything about how one comes off of a fast. You know, this was just a protest because they were holding me in solitary confinement.
It's definitely not with a pork chop.
Definitely not. I know a lot better now. What I discovered, some of the women who worked in the dining room told me that the pork chops had maggots all over them, and they were instructed to cook them anyway and serve them. So from that moment on, well, of course I got extremely ill after having not eaten anything for 10 days, and then I eat this maggot-laden pork chop. And I decided at that moment that I was not going to eat any more meat. It was, you know, pretty much an instantaneous decision. It wasn't political, it wasn't ethical. Once they learned about the terrible cruelty to the animals that are raised under, you know, oftentimes unspeakable conditions, then it might not be so difficult. It might not be so difficult. You know, I think that's the direction we're headed in. This planet will not survive. Most of the pollution, most of the damage that is done to our environment happens as a result of industrial capitalist production of food, and particularly cattle, particularly meat.
And it's interesting because during this this time of social distancing and people being quarantined and all of that, the animals are having a great time. they're going out, they're multiplying.
Oh yeah, they're appearing in places they haven't been seen in decades and perhaps centuries even.
Exactly. I wanted to talk a little bit about your life growing up as a child in Birmingham, Alabama. And I want you to talk a little bit about your parents, Sally and Frank. Can you talk a little bit more about them? What were they like?
Well, both of my parents grew up under conditions of poverty. My mother was a foster child. She never knew who her bio parents were. She grew up in a rural area of Alabama. And interestingly, she basically ran away from home when she was in her teens because she wanted to attend high school, and there was no high school in the area. She moved to Birmingham and attended what was then called Industrial High School. It was later named after the then principal, A.H. Parker, who was struck by my mother's intelligence and by her drive. And as a matter of fact, eventually asked my mother to live with his family. I mean, this is actually how she was able to go to school. She was supported by the A.H. Parker and his wife, and ended up going to an HBCU in Birmingham, Miles College. My father grew up really in the country. He grew up on a farm, and he actually ended up going to college because he was supported by his church, by people in the Episcopal Church. He went to high school, to an HBCU in North Carolina. They were both absolutely insistent on education because it was such a difficult project for them to become educated. They insisted that all of their children receive an education. So, my mother, who was a teacher, started to teach us how to read when we were like 1 or 2. We were all able to read by the time we were 3 or 4. There was no library in Birmingham that was available to Black people. The major library was, of course, segregated. However, there was a small Black library located about, I would say, 10 blocks from our house. And that was where we spent a great deal of our time. My parents insisted that we check out books every week, and she made sure that we read the books. We had to write reports on them. So we grew up in that kind of environment that centered education.
And of course, you grew up in a neighborhood called Dynamite Hill. And the reason why it was called Dynamite Hill, well, just go ahead and explain.
Well, I often talk about the fact that my first real childhood memory is the memory of the sound of bombs across the street from the house where we lived, in an area that, as you pointed out, came to be called Dynamite Hill, because this was an area that had just recently become desegregated, and Black people were allowed to live on one side of the street, but not on the other side. And so whenever a Black family bought a house on the other side of Center Street and moved in, that house would be assaulted by the Ku Klux Klan. There were burnings, there were bombings, there were many bombs. And I have a very vivid memory of the sound of those bombs. I should say also that I have memories of my father pulling his guns out and running outside because some suspicious sound was heard, and the assumption was that it might be a member of the Ku Klux Klan who had planted a bomb in the front yard. For a long time, there were patrols in our community every single night. All of the men in the community got together and developed armed patrols. Many people are aware, of course, of the 16th Street church bombing that happened in 1963 and killed the 4 young girls, one of whom lived 2 doors away from us, and another of whom was a very close friend of my sister. Her mother was a close friend of my mother's. And many people are aware of that bombing, but they don't know that this was a routine strategy of the racists there. And bombs and house burnings occurred all the time. So yeah, that was the environment. Although I shouldn't speak as if it weren't also an environment of joy, because we had fun. And I can even remember when I was very young, there was a white kid who used to play with us, who lived across the street. Of course, we were not allowed to go across the street, but the white people were able to do anything. And so yeah, we played hide and go seek at night, blocks and blocks. It wasn't as if we were afraid, but we were aware that things were not organized in the way that they should be. We knew that racism was wrong. We knew that we should have access to the libraries, to the schools, etc. But I grew up believing that things would change, that time and struggles would bring about change. This is something my mother always said to us. This is not the way things are supposed to be, and they will change. They will be different.
And I wanted to, you always say when you talk about the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing, you always talk about the names of the 4 women and remembering them. And let's do that. Carol Robinson, Cynthia Wesley, Denise McNair, and Addie Mae Collins. I think it's important to name people sometimes so that people can put some humanity into the incident.
Thank you so much. Thank you because I think I wrote an article about the fact that they were only ever called the 4 little girls, and their names were never foregrounded. So thank you for doing that for me.
One of the parents of one of the 4 girls was going to the department store Cresses that was there in Birmingham at the time. And he says that they needed to go use the bathroom or something like that. And of course, everything was segregated, from the water fountains to the bathrooms to the counters, everything else. And he said they walked by the counter where they serve food, and there was a smell of hamburgers and onions and all of this. And the young girl wanted to get a hamburger. And her father told her that she couldn't. And she couldn't understand why she couldn't get a hamburger. And they had to go home that night and explain to her the whole thing of racism. Did your parents try to shelter you from that, or was it there right from the beginning, or most of the parents that lived there?
Well, my mother especially had been an activist for quite some time before I was born. As a matter of fact, she met my father as a result of being involved in an effort to recruit Black men to join the military, to go and fight against fascism abroad and against racism at home. That was the notion of the double V, a victory against fascism in Europe, a victory against racism at home. So we were never sheltered in that respect. We knew about struggles. Some of my parents' closest friends were members of the Communist Party. As a matter of fact, Black communists had come to Birmingham some years before to organize the Southern Negro Youth Congress. And my mother, as it turned out, was an officer in that organization. So we were aware of these struggles. There's an incident I remember. My mother had a white friend from New York, because she actually went to NYU. She got her master's at NYU. And that woman came to visit her in Birmingham. And when my mother drove her, the woman had to lie down on the back seat because it was illegal. They could have both have been arrested. It was illegal for Black and white people to socialize together. So, no, I don't know whether would have been possible to shelter Black children from racism under those kinds of overt conditions. I remember Cress's. It was actually a 5 and 10 cent store. And I remember that soda fountain. And I remember the fact that Black people were not allowed to sit at the counter. I think it was possible to buy food, but only in another area. And my parents didn't allow us to well, you might say, collaborate with that system. So we were never allowed to purchase anything from a segregated establishment that required Black people to go around the back or to go to a particular window. We knew that that's not the way it should have been. Yeah, I mean, I grew up knowing about struggles, but not thinking that struggle was such a bad thing. Not thinking that I grew up, I guess, witnessing struggle as a way of life.
You left Birmingham and you became a professor at UCLA, and you taught philosophy?
Mm-hmm. Well, okay. I left Birmingham and finished high school in New York.
Mm-hmm.
I had the opportunity of spending 2 years at a wonderful high school, Little Red Schoolhouse in Greenwich Village. And I then went to Boston. And after that, I went to France, and then I went to Germany, and then I went to San Diego, and then I ended up at UCLA.
I was fast forwarding a little bit here.
Exactly.
Did you enjoy your time in Europe?
Oh yes, I did. And I still feel very much connected to particularly people who are involved in struggles in Europe. I still have a lot of connections in Paris and in Germany. And I usually end up making at least one visit a year to those places. I was actually on my way to Switzerland when we were instructed to shelter in place.
And of course, you know, those European friends became huge allies during the Free Angela movement.
Oh, absolutely. Yes, some of my friends and colleagues with whom I studied in Frankfurt were very much organized in building committees in Berlin, in Frankfurt. Of course, James Baldwin, whom I had met in the US, wrote an open letter to me that served as an impetus to create an international movement. And the professor with whom I worked, Herbert Marcuse, who was from Germany, connected with what we call the Frankfurt School, a number of professors who were involved in creating the field critical theory. So he was also responsible for generating a great deal of support from intellectuals all over Europe. And then, of course, because I was a member of the Communist Party was central in creating this international campaign that existed all over the world. That kind of internationalism is an internationalism that we need today, I think. And we have to figure out how to draw from those experiences and how to create networks of international solidarity to address you know, what is going on in Brazil and the Philippines and India. Uh, yeah, as a matter of fact, I think this crisis, this COVID-19 crisis, is a crisis of capitalism and an indication of the limitations of global capitalism. As a matter of fact, we would not have experienced it in the way we have had it not been for the fact that the healthcare system had become completely privatized, you know, as a result of the impact of global capitalism and neoliberalism. But now I've fast forwarded.
Well, since you took the segue to this, I want to continue in that vein of thought. Do you think we're going to come out of this? How do you see the pluses that obviously you want to look for hopeful signs of what's going on today? What do you see the hopeful signs that are coming out of this?
Well, you know, first of all, I think that that we're not going to return to where we were before. You know, there's talk about a return to normalcy. It won't be the same normalcy that we experienced prior to the coronavirus. I think that many people are aware of the fact that working people who make very low wages, are the most essential workers in our society. And of course, some of us were aware of the centrality of the working class before. But I think the crisis has made it clear to people who were not necessarily aware before that something is wrong when the people you most depend on are the people who are most essential to the economy, are people who are making the lowest wages, and are people who are now exposed more consistently to the health hazard of the coronavirus. So I'm hoping that as we move toward the next phase, you know, whatever that becomes, there is this awareness of the importance of recognizing the value of working people, working class people, poor people, people of color. You know, there are those who are saying that they're shocked that the death rate is so much higher in Black communities and Latinx communities. But of course, if they understood anything about structural racism, they would certainly be aware of the way that continues to work under these conditions of crisis. So I suppose I would say I'm hoping that as we move towards the next phase, we have the capacity to build the kind of movements that will lead us to a different future. You know, to a future that recognizes that capitalism does not work for the majority of people. It works only for those who are able to benefit from the profit drive that is central to the whole capitalist process.
So let's move to 1968. You're at UCLA at that point, correct? And you're teaching, and you made enemies with Ronald Reagan, well as Nixon, but you made enemies with Ronald Reagan, and you were fired from your job. Is that correct?
Yeah, and you know, that was something that that came as a shock to me. of course, I was a member of the Communist Party. I had been doing radical work for a very long time. I was invited to teach in the philosophy department at UCLA because they needed someone to teach Marxism. And Marxism and continental European philosophy. And that was my field.
Well, they wanted
And
the
so,
sanitized part of communism. They didn't want the real communism. They wanted the sanitized part.
exactly. Well, no, the chair of the philosophy department there was very good. So they knew what they were getting, and they knew that I was a member of the Communist Party. It was just that I think it was an FBI agent who had infiltrated the Communist Party, who revealed that I had been hired by UCLA and that I was a member of the Communist Party, and that's how it all started. I was in Cuba cutting cane, trying to assist in the development of the Cuban Revolution when all of this was happening in Southern California, when they discovered that I was a member of the Communist Party, when I guess the plans were made to fire me. So when I returned, it was literally a culture.
But you were quickly reinstated. Is that correct?
It was complicated. I was fired, and my lawyers took the case to court, and within a very short period of time, the Supreme Court ruled that I could not be fired for my political beliefs and affiliation, and therefore I was reinstated and ended up teaching for 1 year. And at the end of the year, Ronald Reagan and the regents of the University of California fired me again, this time for different reasons, for conduct unbecoming a professor, because I was very much involved in political projects as well and had done a great deal of speaking on behalf of the Soledad brothers, George Jackson and the Soledad brothers. So that became the occasion for firing me the second time.
And the Soledad brothers were the three Black men who were in San Quentin. Isn't that correct?
Initially, they were incarcerated at Soledad prison. It was George Jackson, Frida Drango, and John Fluchet. They were charged with killing a guard at Soledad. A guard was killed at Soledad in the course of a reaction, a response to a prisoner having been killed on the yard. And it's a long story, but everybody at the prison, especially the Black prisoners, were very, very upset, and there was basically a riot, and the guard got thrown over the side of the tier, and no one knew who did this. No one knows who did this. But because George and John and Frida were politically active within the prison, they were pinpointed, they were targeted, and the three of them were charged with murder.
And they were transferred then to San Quentin?
The transfer to San Quentin came when the trial actually took.
I see.
When I'm trying to remember, they were transferred to San Quentin. I think in 1970. Yeah, the end of the summer of 1970.
So then what happened? There was
There was also a case called the San Quentin Six.
right.
And sometimes people confuse those. And that happened as a result of George Jackson having been assassinated within the prison, and six other prisoners, including both Fleta and John, were part of the San Quentin Six.
Uh-huh. So then there was, can you talk a little bit about the conditions that then put you on the FBI wanted list?
Well, okay, we talked about the fact that I was fired from my position at UCLA. And I found out about the case of the Soledad brothers shortly after I began to teach there and began to address all of the because I was a member of the Communist Party, there was anti-communism that was mixed up with racism, that was mixed up with misogyny. And as I taught at UCLA, I received threats, death threats, almost every day. I was very aware of the connections between what was happening to me, the political repression that was focused on me, and what was happening to the Soledad brothers when I found out about their case. And I attempted to make connections between the two cases. I argued that I was a target of political repression on the campus of UCLA, and they were targets of political repression within the prison system. And what I was trying to do was to persuade people who had decided to support me, because of course, there were a lot of people who argued that academic freedom should be respected, freedom of speech, and so forth. And so my argument, was yes, that was the case, but it was also important to recognize the political repression inherent in the attack on my right to teach by the regents. And in order to do this, I spoke about the case of the Soledad brothers almost every time I talked about my own situation. And I can remember one of the things I said pretty regularly, that all I stand to lose is my job. But the Soledad brothers can lose their lives because they were charged with capital crimes. And so I spent a lot of time trying to encourage people to think these cases together, intersectionally, you might say today, to recognize that if they were supporting me, they should also be supporting the Soledad brothers.
Interesting. And that was before you went to jail, of course. You were involved in that movement.
Oh yes, absolutely. And I should say that that when I was at UCLA, I received death threats almost every day. And so I had to have security. The campus police were very good about, making sure that no one attacked me on the campus. And I always say, they wanted to make sure I did not get killed on the campus of UCLA. But of course, every day when I left, they simply said goodbye. They would sometimes inspect my car to make sure a bomb hadn't been planted, and so forth and so on. And so I had to have personal security, and I also had to buy the weapons that my security used. And so So I was the legal owner of a couple of guns that were used by the people who did security for me, who would meet me every day, drive me home from the campus. They stayed at my house, and it was not a very happy situation. And it was a result of the fact that George Jackson's young brother, Jonathan, who also did security for me, used those guns in an effort to free his brother, that I became charged with murder, kidnapping, and conspiracy.
Because the gun was registered in your name.
It was registered, yes, absolutely.
So then you had to go into hiding. How long did that last?
Not that long. Seemed like it was an eternity, of course, at the time. I ended up spending some time in Chicago. Then I spent some time in Miami. And ended up in New York, where I was captured by the FBI. A young man by the name of David Poindexter was accompanying me, and I'm still so thankful to him, because he really put his life on the line and traveled with me and used his connections to find places for us to. We used to say during my trial, what we said was that I was making myself unavailable to the FBI.
Did you ever think of leaving the country?
Yes, I did. Of course I did.
So why did you leave the country? It couldn't have been that hard.
Well, because I was ambivalent. I was very ambivalent about leaving the country. I had spent a great deal of time out of the country, and I would have more than likely been able to discover a place that would grant me political asylum. I could have gone to Cuba, for example. But I didn't want to find myself in a situation where I was compelled to live somewhere else, where I would not be able to have contact with my family, my friends, my comrades. And I was aware of the fact that people were building campaigns for my freedom, that my friends and comrades were involved in building groups and committees and various in New York and Los Angeles and various parts of the country. So my strategy was to remain unavailable to those who wanted to arrest me until such time as a substantial movement within the country could be created, so that when I did stand trial, as I eventually did, of course, there would be a significant amount of support within the country.
Mm-hmm.
And it worked. It worked.
And he had lots of support from great people, including someone like Aretha Franklin, who offered to pay your bail, but ended up wasn't able to because she was out of the country at the time, right? And some white farmer came through and made bail for you?
I'll forever be grateful to Aretha, because the very fact that she announced that she was willing to pay bail for me marked an important moment in the campaign. And of course, I'm certain that many other people associated themselves with the movement as a result. Are you still there?
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
Okay, let me see. Oh, all right. Now, and so Yeah, Aretha was in the Caribbean when I was when I became eligible for bail. You see, the problem was initially I wasn't eligible for bail because I had been charged with a capital
Yeah,
offense,
yeah, yeah.
and and no one could have predicted that the death penalty in the state of California would be declared unconstitutional. Uh, and it was for a moment. And because Aretha was not available, well, I would say that the flow of capital and everything else that's characteristic of global capitalism did not yet exist, so that it was
Ah,
not possible to transfer large amounts of money within short periods of time, as is possible today. Um, and and so we really didn't know what we were going to do because nobody had that kind of money. It was, you know, it doesn't seem like nearly as much today. Bail was $100,000, but in those days it was that was a vast sum of money. And a man by the name of Roger McAfee, a white farmer in Central California, in the Fresno area, showed up at my attorney's office and said that he was willing to put his farm up for my bail, which was absolutely remarkable because that meant that I got out the next day, and of course I'll forever be grateful to Roger for that courageous step that he took. I should also say that as a result of the fact that he used his farm for my bail, Ku Klux Klan and other races began to attack his farm and kill his animals. And so people who were involved in the campaign for my freedom had to provide security for his farm, armed security for his farm for several years, as a matter of fact.
I know we're a little bit short on time, so I want to move fast forward a little bit to a more contemporary topic, which you and Gina have been very involved in, and that's the abolition of prisons. Can we talk a little bit about that movement? I know that people have referred to you as a prison reformer, but you correct them quickly and say, no, you're about abolishing the prison system that we have today. Can you talk a little bit about what that looks like? What does abolishing prisons look like?
Well, yeah, people tend to assume that if you are working to improve the conditions of people who are behind bars, if you're critical of the prison system, that you must certainly be a reformer. You must certainly want to create a better prison system. Excuse me. But if one looks at the history of prisons in this country, and of course the US is responsible for the existence of prisons all over the world as the major form of punishment, one sees that there were abolitionist strategies that were introduced at the very beginning of the history of the prison. And so the reason many of us refer to ourselves as abolitionists is because we want to create a society that no longer requires these violent, repressive institutions. Better prisons, and this has been the demand of reformers for decades and decades, have better prisons. The demand for better prisons has led to more repressive prisons, more racist prisons, has led to the expansion of prisons. And so rather than assume that you can make this institution better, why not ask, how can one address the reasons why so many people end up going to prison? And of course, during this period that we call the period of mass incarceration, we are aware of the role that racism plays. The majority of people in prison are people of color. And we recognize that there is a connection between slavery and the existing prison system. And so our approach has been to ask people to try to imagine what it would be like to live in a world without prisons. What would you need if you had no prisons? You would need a better educational system. You would need a non-privatized healthcare system. You would need housing that is available to everyone. You would need jobs that are available.
More mental health.
You would need mental health, exactly. You would need ways of addressing disability, whether it's physical disability or intellectual disability. So yes, the call for abolition does not focus myopically at the prison system. It looks at the whole society, and it asks, what would we need to create a society that does not need these institutions of violence and repression? One can say the same thing about the police. We've never been able to make the police better. Why not think of a different mode of security, a mode of security that is not grounded in violence?
Yeah, are there examples in the world that you know of that actually do better? I mean, I know there are a lot of countries that do better than we do, but what country should we look to that is doing a much better job in these issues?
Well, I don't know whether there is a specific place one can point to, because unfortunately, even in countries that had better systems than exists in this country today, they've been following the leadership of the US. The Netherlands, for example, had, and they continue to have a better system, an open system, where people during the last third of their terms are able to live in the free world. They have situations in which people go to work. They may live in the prison, but they work outside. So, all of these have been efforts to create better systems. But when global capitalism began to emerge during the 1980s, and when punishment became thoroughly connected to capitalist projects, and we began to see even the privatization of the services within prisons, then privatization of the entire prisons, the creation of private prisons, then they suffered as well, and they ended up also becoming more repressive in their prison system. But I think it is important to look at other places and to recognize that what exists here in the US is horrendous. There's no other country where so many people end up spending significant portions of their lives behind bars. The US, as everyone knows, the US constitutes approximately 5% of the world's population, but 25% of the imprisoned population is here in the US. And then, of course, it's important to recognize that Brazil is becoming, and Brazil, of course, which has the largest Black population outside of the continent of Africa, and a great deal of police repression, even worse, perhaps, than what we were experiencing in this country. Brazil now has the third largest prison population in the world, behind the US and China. And so they are also, that radical activists in Brazil are also building an abolitionist movement, because they recognize that as their prison population grows and develops, it makes no sense to call for better conditions, simply call for better conditions. Of course, prisoners need better conditions, but to assume that that is going to solve the problem does not get at the root cause, the racism, the economic exploitation, and all of the other reasons why people end up going to prison.
Finally, I want to talk to you a little bit about electoral politics. I know we're in the middle of an election that's going to take place hopefully in November. Where are you on that? I know you've talked about that. I think Obama was probably one of the first presidents you ever actually advocated for, if I'm not mistaken. But can you speak a little bit about the role of electoral politics?
Well, I think electoral politics are, of course, really important. And for Black people, especially. We have fought too long for the right to vote, to simply treat it as something not to be taken seriously today. So I have to say that I've always voted. As a matter of fact, the very first time I tried to register to vote, I couldn't because it was in Alabama, and the conditions of racist segregation still prevail. So I have always voted, but I have voted independently. I have not, until the Obama election, I had never voted for one of the major candidates. I always vote for Peace and Freedom Party, Green Party, Communist Party, whatever. And I still believe that we need a new approach. We need a political party that represents working class people, that represents people who are racially oppressed and marginalized. And we don't have that in the existing two-party structure. So my position is that electoral politics are not necessarily the best place to give expression to radical politics. But electoral politics are absolutely essential. I think I made the point that the last election, when the person who is currently in office was elected, the current occupant of the White House, I voted for Hillary Clinton, and I advocated for people to vote for her. Not because I believe that Hillary was the answer, not because I believed that she was going to usher us to freedom, but because I believe that we needed more space to do the kind of organizing work that will eventually help to change this society. And so therefore, in participating in the electoral process, I want to create more and more space, a greater arena for those of us who believe that freedom is not going to come as long as we are um, determined by all of these capitalist strictures. So that's my position, and it's still my position.
Are you going to vote for Biden? If I could ask you.
Well, you know, I would prefer a better candidate.
I think most people would,
but I'm certainly going to vote against the current person.
Very good.
And if it means that I have to vote for him, I will. You know, I mean, to me, that's logical. That's the only thing that makes sense.
And just quickly, I know you've done a lot of work on Palestine and the issue of Palestine. What's going on today, the annexation of land, you know, willy-nilly, just it's really pretty horrible. Are you in touch with a lot of folks from the region?
Oh, yes, absolutely. You know, we in this country are so indebted to Palestinian activists and leaders. And I say this remembering that when I was in jail, we were talking about that early on. Palestinian political prisoners sent solidarity messages to me when I was in jail. Mm. I will never forget that. And I have the opportunity when I visited Palestine in 2011 to meet someone who had been in prison at that time, who told me about the efforts they made to gather the names of prisoners who supported the demand for my freedom. More recently, when the Ferguson protests took place, Palestinians were the first to express solidarity and were at the forefront of the development of a major global solidarity movement for Black Lives Matter. And so I see the connection, especially of the Black struggles and struggles against racism in this country and Palestinians as being unbreakable. And of course, given the current situation in which, well, you know, let's not even talk about what's happening with Netanyahu and the efforts to further engage in practices of annexation. You know, basically, they're trying to annex Palestine out of existence. I mean, the strategy has always been a demographic strategy of trying to guarantee that the population in that area is going to be increasingly monopolized by Israel, so that Palestine will be basically annexed out of existence. And you know, it's just amazing that ideologically, the way in which people have been persuaded that Israel is a progressive country. It's just unbelievable. You know, that people refuse to recognize the role that Israel has played in the militarization of the planet and the development of police departments all over this country, even campus police departments in some instances, who are trained in the counterinsurgency methods of the Israeli military. But you know, we could do an entire talk. What is this? A dinner table conversation?
Right, dinner conversation about Palestine. We may do that. I want to particularly thank you as an Arab of of Middle Eastern descent and having lived in the region for some time, it's really important to have your voice in this conversation. And it is a very powerful one, and it's very, very much loved and appreciated. So thank you. Keep it going. I wanted to finally ask you what inspires you, what keeps you going. You have such a positive approach to life, and you always seem very hopeful, even despite the most difficult times. Tell me what keeps you going. I know you do a lot of meditation, you do yoga, you do all of these wonderful things. I've seen you in person do those things. Can can you share with our audience what inspires you?
Yeah, I was a little, when I came and tried to join you, I think I just finished a yoga class, a long yoga class. So I was, not quite here. Yeah, I do all of those things. And during this shelter in place, I think we've been doing at least 1 or 2 yoga Pilates classes every day. And I think that's important. But it's also important to link those modes of what we now call self-care to our collective movements. They shouldn't be seen simply as an individual strategy to make us feel better, but rather they should be a part of organizing for radical social change. And I think increasingly we're beginning to see that those connections are made. Yeah, I am a hopeful person, but it's not hope with no evidence of the possibility of change. It's not abstract hope. It's hope that has been generated over decades and as a result of having participated in movements that may not have been successful in the way we desired, but that have indeed at the same time changed our worlds. And my hope emanates from the work that young people are doing. Mm. I am so excited when I see young people who have not only learned how to do the kind of organizing that's so necessary now, but they've developed discourses that are so complicated and so interesting and so, they take for granted what we could hardly figure out 30 years ago or 40 years ago. And that's change, that's transformation. The world changes, and they are the ones who are going to move us in the direction of a very different future. And so that always makes me helpful. Whenever I see a young person, it's, especially kids in high school who now really can talk about prison questions and use the terms related to abolition. We talk about decarceration, and when I hear people talking about intimate violence or domestic violence, and recognize the connections between what happens in individual relationships and what happens in prisons and what happens at the hands of the police. It took us so long to work out a framework within which we could bring those issues together. And now young people take it for granted that that's the way it is, and they're going somewhere else. And that is what gives me hope. And I think the best thing we can do is to create arenas of struggle that allow coming generations to take up the baton and move further in the direction of the future.
Well, I want to say thank you so much. It's always such a joy to be in your presence, honestly. I mean, uh, you make me smile. You give me a sense of hope. You give me a sense of restoration and really belief and at times when I think that is so necessary. So thank you. Thank you so much, Angela. I give my very best to Gina as well.
I will. I will. And thank you, Andy, for inviting me. And Busboys and Poets. Uh, I um, I think of you all the time, and
Thank you.
I hope you're doing well. I hope you're doing well.
We love you.
If I could order out, if I could order out, I would. But unfortunately, I'm in Oakland,
well,
so
we want to encourage everybody that's listening actually to use local independent businesses. This is the time that they need you the most. So if anybody's listening out there, please use local independent businesses. Thank you. Take care.
okay. And thank you too.
Bye-bye.
Goodbye.
Well, we've had a wonderful conversation with Angela Davis. I know there was a lot more that we needed to talk about. Obviously, I wanted to sort of take her through every year of her history and kind of go through that, but we wanted to speed it up a little bit and bring it to a more present time so that our listeners can enjoy that part. If you'd like to get in touch with us, you can tweet me, Andy Shalal, AndyShallal, or you can Instagram. I have Instagram as well, Andy Shalal. And I appreciate all of you, and I appreciate your support. And we will get through this. I mean, I know that. I know that these are very difficult times, and we're really trying very hard to try to, every day is like discovery. And we're coming up with solutions as we confront them. And we look forward to seeing you on the other side, which hopefully will not be too long from now. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful weekend.